he basically has to beat Piastri in pretty much every race going forward, assuming they're 1-2. And if they're not 1-2, then he kind of has to beat him in even more of them. So yeah, he's got to go out and have an absolutely outstanding end to the season.
This is On Track, talkSPORT's weekly motorsport show, available on talkSPORT 2, the talkSPORT Podcast Network and the talkSPORT Driving YouTube channel. I am John Jackson, and we are looking back at the first race back after the F1 summer break, the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort, the penultimate race at Zandvoort for this stint of it hosting a race. And it was a series of unfortunate events and not much of a race. To look back on it, Piers Pryor, former British F3 driver and Sky Sports F3 commentator, is alongside me. And lots seemed to happen, Piers, but there wasn't much of a race.
Yeah, I was watching it at home and I was kind of thinking, like, I was waiting for the rain to come, waiting for some overtakes. Yeah, there was a few bits and pieces here and there, but I was really wanting something a bit more. You kind of alluded to it. Lots of events happening, lots to talk about, but not exactly a top draw race that we're going to be thinking about for years to come.
Yeah, we'll break it down as we go along. Let's start then, of course, with the race result. And it kind of was set up by qualifying, wasn't it? Because Oscar Piastri took pole position, out-qualifying his teammate Lando Norris by, 1/100th of a second, just over. So, how many centimetres would that be, would you say, difference?
Oh, it's only got to be only a car length or two over the whole race, over the whole racetrack. So very, very close. But I think this is a real another example of the mental strength that Piastri is showing, because Norris was faster and quite convincingly so in pretty much every lap that they did in all the practice sessions. And Piastri started the weekend on the back foot and really chipped away, got closer and closer, and then just delivered when it mattered. And ultimately, I think regardless of what happened to Norris, we'll talk about that in a bit, I'm sure, Piastri was probably going to win that race, and he deserved to, because he outperformed Norris once again. And that's something we've spoken about before. I think he's consistently outperforming Norris, especially when it comes down to the moments it matters.
Yeah, so the start of the race, you've got the two McLarens on pole position. You've got Max Verstappen just behind with Isaac Hadjar starting fourth, which we're going to talk about Isaac in one of the parts of this show. And he was super impressive. And, to be in his best qualifying position, it was fantastic for him. And the weekend only got better. We have a start where I think I texted you at the time and I said, Lando Norris has got a bad start again, but it wasn't a bad start from Lando Norris. In fact, he possibly got a better start than Oscar did. It was just that at that track, Oscar could close him off into the first corner and get the advantage. But it was really Max Verstappen that we were excited to see on that first lap, because he basically did everything he could and he nearly lost it. And I was just wondering, from a driver's perspective, we saw the save that he did. I think it was maybe just going around turn 3 or into turn 3. How close was he to crashing there? Because it looked pretty hairy from my perspective.
That was about as close you can get to a crash, and it took all of Verstappen's skill and I think a fair dose of luck there. Honestly, I think he was a couple of kilometres an hour or a few centimetres away from genuinely just spinning around into the wall, and it would have been quite dramatic because he would literally have been in the path of the remainder of the grid. So that was not planned and very, very lucky from Verstappen. But hey, he put himself in a good position. He was going to go all in. That's why he went so wide. He was already trying to get past Norris, was looking to try and make a move on the McLarens, because he knew realistically the only chance of him getting a win was to get in front of the McLarens, control the race. I think, honestly, ultimately, it would have been futile anyway. We saw Norris got past Verstappen a few laps later anyway, and that would have happened with Piastri if he had got through into the lead of the race. But yeah, genuinely so close to a crash. Wasn't all skill involved in him continuing on. But yeah, as you said, did all he could. Get in second place, at least held Norris up for a bit. But then again, that's Norris's sort of season, isn't it? Just missed out on qualifying, which then puts him in a position to be overtaken because he was boxed in. And that allowed Piastri just more space, and it shows how crucial it is to perform when it matters.
What do you make of a lot of people? I've seen a lot of race reviews that I was reading, because I was kind of doing some football for talkSPORT, and I was kind of half watching the race at the same time. And then I watched the race back, and a lot of the reviews were sort of saying that Oscar got a bit lucky in qualifying because of wind. And we know it's very windy at Zandvoort. We've both been there together with GB3. We know that it's a very windy place and the conditions can change very quickly as it's so close to the coast. But, could a small gust of wind have helped Oscar that much?
100%. I mean, a wind on a lap, when it's somewhere as windy as that and as gusty as that, wind can be probably up to, if not more than a tenth, if you're just in the right place when the wind gusts. If you get a gust on your tail down the straight and then not in a headwind and flip it round, it could be anywhere near up to a 10th. But ultimately, Oscar was further back than that away from Norris in practice. I think he was a couple of tenths shy at the start of the weekend, got closer and closer. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter with the wind. You've got to do the lap anyway. And he was the one in this case that delivered. And it's again just showing the mental strength of Piastri to start on the back foot and then not over push, not try and go too far, have a spin, have a terrible weekend. I haven't, we don't get to see the ins and outs of the data, unfortunately. It would be nice to maybe have a look at the finer details. When it comes down to 100th of a second, that's almost immeasurable, even in telemetry, whether it's wind or not, because 100th of a second, that's like if you break half a meter later into one of the corners, you can gain 100th of a second. So, it's within noise. Therefore, he still did the lap. He was still faster than Norris and still deserved to take pole position.
It's not just Formula One where it's close. We were actually at a karting event recently, weren't we? The British Karting Championships. And there was one race finish that was so close that they were having to look at photos. It was like a proper old racing thing, wasn't it? Like horse racing, where they were looking at a photo to try and work out who was ahead. And, the racing can come down to these tiny little margins. And I think Oscar's really worked on making sure those little margins go in his favour this season, after Australia at least. When we look at Lando Norris, and we're going to talk about what happened to him in just a second, but when we see him off the line from pole position, there's a kind of running joke that he doesn't normally lead the race by the end of the first lap. He wasn't on pole position for this race. He got a decent start, but again, he wasn't in the same place where he started by the end of the first lap because Max Verstappen had got past him. What is it about the first lap that you think could be a struggle for Lando Norris? Is it just drivers take a little bit of time to settle into the race a bit quicker, or something you do in your prep that means that Oscar can just get focused quicker? I mean, what do you think it is?
Do you know what, the way I think about it from my experience as a driver, and again, granted, I've not driven to Formula One level, but I've had a fair amount of experience racing at fairly high levels in a number of different championships over the years, and figured out what works, what doesn't, and have a fairly decent understanding of how the psychology of this sort of thing works. But it's effectively a risk versus reward profile that you have almost sort of built in your brain from the way you are as a person, your intrinsic personality, the way you go about racing, the situation and everything like that. And some drivers have lean more on the risk side. They're more likely to gamble. Other drivers are more naturally a bit more reserved and just maybe would rather lose a position or a couple of positions and be clean. I think Norris falls more on that side. Then given the position where he knows he's in a championship hunt and he can't afford contact, and he's the one that's alongside Verstappen, he realistically knows that Verstappen is not going to be able to stay with him. And it's almost better for his championship if he loses the position to Verstappen without any risk of contact and losing the race than it is to lose that position and gain it back and then maybe allow Piastri to go ahead and get a bit of a gap. You have some drivers that fall like Norris on the reserved side, Verstappen generally, example, on the other side. Piastri, I think, generally sits pretty much about perfect, and which is another example of these fine margins and why he's been doing so well. But it's a fine margin because also you can't push too far the other way, otherwise you end up in a situation like, let's say, Antonelli. I don't know if it's unfair, but a driver who's low on confidence and is trying to almost force their way out of it by not going into their shoulder, almost coming out swinging and then pushing too hard. And we saw the contact with Leclerc. That's a sort of the situation that I see. And so then maybe I think Norris could afford to in future just push a bit more and take a bit more risk. And there's been a bit of chatter since the race that now he's in a position where he's more than a race win behind in terms of points. He kind of has to beat Piastri every weekend pretty much from now on to the end of the season to get him the championship. Maybe that's sort of like the weights off his shoulders. He can afford to take a bit more risk because if he doesn't take that risk, he's guaranteed not to win the championship. So yeah, it's a weird one. Again, talking about the fine margins a moment ago, motorsport, the margins really are that fine, not only with lap times, but also your approach, your risk versus reward, because it's such an organic thing. You're racing multiple different people on the same part of the circuit with completely different cars, wind, different drivers trying to do different things. Verstappen's going to be taking higher risk moves because he doesn't have to worry about losing points in championship, whereas Norris can't afford to.
Yeah, so Lando Norris obviously did not finish the race. Something like, I think, 5 laps before the end of the race, there was an engine issue. We know it's not a Mercedes issue because McLaren use Mercedes engines, so something that they'll be looking into ahead of Monza this coming weekend. But very bad luck for him. It wasn't like he did anything particularly wrong. It was just one of those things. And it means now he's 34 points behind his teammate Oscar Piastri. And your calculations say that he's got to make up, 4 points per race now?
Yeah, 3.7 or something, but obviously you can't do that. So he basically has to beat Piastri in pretty much every race going forward, assuming they're 1-2. And if they're not 1-2, then he kind of has to beat him in even more of them. So yeah, he's got to go out and have an absolutely outstanding end to the season to give himself a realistic chance, or hope that Piastri has some luck that sort of bounces back.
Yeah, of course. Back in the day, Formula One used to have that element of surprise, didn't it? Where cars were quite unreliable at times and you'd see big plumes of smoke coming out the back and, very unfortunate moments for drivers who are in great positions. But it doesn't really happen anymore. So it was kind of a bit of a shock to see that. In terms of the team's championship, the Constructors' Championship, 584 points to Ferrari in second on 260. So they're just extending their lead, over double the amount of points to the next best team. So, McLaren are going to make it back-to-back championships in the Constructors' Championships for sure. And they're going to have a Drivers' Champion as well. So things looking very, very rosy for McLaren.